Hello folks. Okay, well, the last couple of sessions we've gone through and looked at creating a bash script to go through and run a single fairly complex test case for us on a program under test. And we looked at how we might go through and create another script to go through and apply a whole suite of tests using that one that runs a single test. So what I want to take a look at today is how we might organize the data, the actual test case information for all of those individual cases. So we looked at this idea of having our individual test cases might have a whole suite of different options that they expected. -T and then the name of the file of the program that we're testing, -O and the name of a file that's got the expected standard output, etc., etc., etc. And then for each individual test case, we'd have one file that had all of those arguments listed in it for that test case. So it would have the -T value to use, and the -O value to use, and the -R value to use, right? The names of each of the files for those cases. So we've got a whole slew of different files for each individual test case. We've got the description file that goes through to summarize it all, right? That's got the command line arguments to use. And then we've got all those files that have got the specific chunks of data in it. The file that's got the expected standard output for that test case. The file that's got the expected standard error for that test case. The file that's got the command line arguments to be used for that test case. So there's lots of different files to deal with for each case. So I want to talk a little bit about just how we might go through and try and organize all that information. So I'm going to assume that we've actually implemented that tester2 script that runs a single test case for us. And we've implemented that test collection script that uses tester2 and a whole suite of different test description files to actually apply all of this stuff. And again, each test description file has the command line arguments that are supposed to be passed to tester2, so the -A whatever, the -T whatevers. And we need the actual data files that all of these things refer to. So somewhere we've got to organize all of that. Somehow we need documentation that tells us where this stuff is found so that the new person that comes in to join our testing team knows where to find all this. And if they run a test and it fails, or if they run a test and something blows up, they know where to find the file that it blew up on. And so we need some kind of documentation for all of this and some kind of reasonable organization for all of it. So what I want is, for each test case, I want that description file that's got all the command line arguments listed in it to be named reasonably intuitively, right? Where the name reflects what the test case is doing. So, you don't have a whole, and I'm terrible at this when I'm putting together examples. I don't have a whole slew of files that are T1, T2, T3, T4. Right? You want something where the name of the file actually reflects what that test case is about. So each of those files is going to have a whole bunch of different command line arguments to be passed to the tester2 script, but we want it to be something that we can read and edit reasonably cleanly. So maybe we do something like, whatever the arguments are, each line is one argument and the accompanying file name, and then just something like a line continuation character at the end. So that effectively the entire file content can be used as just one long bash argument. Right? So we can go through and just come up with a whole suite of these things where it's -whatever and then a file name, -whatever and a file name. And these might be relative paths, they might be absolute paths, who knows. But again, we've got our options set up this way. Where do we put these test description files, right? We talked about the idea when we were looking at the collection script of having our test description files organized into directories and subdirectories and things. It would probably make sense to have one master directory that all the rest of them are in there someplace, so that if we ever want to run everything, we just give it the name of that master directory. But then within that, we might have them categorized. So we might have, error tests, and we might have tests that are supposed to succeed, and we might have a bunch of base case tests. I don't know what if we've got something that's supposed to be processing. We might have a bunch of test cases based on what it does with invalid file content. But again, depending on the nature of the program under test, you might break all of your individual tests up into categories with a separate directory for each. And again, those might be subcategorized, where you've got subdirectories for each of the other categories. But again, this is something that you'd want to document and something you'd want to be reasonably consistent about, so that you've got some kind of structure to where to find all of your different test description files. So you've got that aspect for how do you structure your test description files. And then there's all the data files that are used for the individual test cases. Right? You've got all of these different files for, the expected standard output, the expected standard error, the command line arguments to use, the names of any input files to use, the names of any checker scripts to use, all that kind of information. Right? All of those files have to exist someplace. Where they exist needs to be documented. And again, where they exist needs to have some kind of logical structure to it. So it's not just this kind of weird mix of, well, sometimes we put it over here and sometimes we put it over there and sometimes just, wherever it happens to be. So it might be the case that we go through and say, well, maybe I'll have a collection of directories for the test case information, where I say, if I've got test description file foo, then I'll have a directory foo someplace that's got all of the data files inside that somewhere. Or who knows, I can come up with all sorts of different logical structures for where I'm going to put the actual test data, right? All of these different files that were going to be used. So it might be the case that we break it up, and so that we've got one directory that contains all of the standard input files that we want to use, and another directory that's got all of the expected standard out, and another directory that's got all of the expected standard error, right, with one for each of the different test cases. So we might break it up that way, or we might break it up by test case and say, okay, well, all of the files for this one test case are in this one directory. Right? Lots of different ways that we can structure this that make sense, and it's really a matter of what your team and what your team thinks makes sense for the project that you're working with, or for the processes that they're used to following for other projects. And again, you want this to be relatively simple. You want a process that's easy to follow, and a structure that's easy to follow, a layout that's easy to follow, so that you reduce the chance that a tester is going to make just a silly mistake when they're going through and just dropping something in the wrong directory someplace. So again, different possible organizations that you can go through. Right? A directory for each test case, or a directory for each different kind of file. And again, the idea of documentation, right? You need a good scheme for your team, a good scheme for your project, you need to document it, and you need to make sure that people actually follow it. The same idea as for any form of standards, where you want to make sure that it's clear and that people actually know where to find it and follow it. Again, you want documentation to be that you can use, that you can follow up on, right? So you can find these files if you need to, you can run the test cases if you need to. If something goes wrong, you can figure out where the data file is that uses that. If something needs to be modified, you can find the right place and modify the right thing. You're not going to accidentally break a test case by editing the wrong file. Right? You want documentation on how to use these different scripts, right? Documentation on how to add a new test case, documentation on how to modify a test case, documentation on what the different options for your tester 2 are, and what the different options for your test collection script are. And ideally, you want examples for each, so that you can have a great long spiel about how things are supposed to work, but if you don't include a couple of practical examples, it's really difficult for people to follow along. So again, these are all things to think about when you're looking at the automation process. All right, I think I will leave that one there.